Light Pollution News, August 2025, establishing precedent. This episode, a new crime study tells us that maybe streetlights aren't as impactful as public officials claim they are. Also, this episode, do streetlights get a bad rap? And what if a protective coating could cut satellite brightness by half? All this and much more engaging conversation we had. With me this month are Sky and Telescope's Kelly Beatty, fresh off of his recent cruise ship engagement, Dark Source's Kerem Asfuroglu, and David Smith from Bug Life, who comes bearing a new campaign. You'll certainly want to stick around for this one. All this is next. Welcome to another Light Pollution News. I'm your host, Bill McGeaney. Thank you for joining me this episode. We do this show every other week, looking at all of the topics in the news around the topic of nighttime preservation. I'd like to give a shout out to any new listeners with us today. Thank you for tuning in. As a reminder, you can find everything we talk about over on our website, lightpollutionnews.com. I really try and make this site a resource for you, the listener. So it has all of the links to all of today's stories, all of past show stories. It has a show breakdown and summary for you to easily, quickly read your way through everything. And of course, I have my show walk along, which is essentially my show notes for today's show. If you like what we're doing and you want to see us succeed, you can assist us in one of two ways. First, you can become a supporter. As a supporter, you'll receive all of the articles that I pull each month. This month, we're over 150 articles again. You'll receive that in Excel sheet. It'll be able to link and names for each article, very organized. You also receive a quarterly invite to join the show as an audience member if you so choose. You can be a supporter for as low as $3 a month, and that money goes directly to the show to fund many of the costs that we incur each month. If you don't wish to become a supporter, no worries, but you still want to actually support the show, we ask you to please share something that you found interesting in today's show with friends or colleagues. Every little bit of awareness helps us continue to grow and ensure that we'll be around for a long time to come, helping to keep this topic pertinent and well flushed out. As a reminder, you can find us on social media outlets. You can join our mailing list. You can even text the show. It's all right there in today's show notes from whatever podcast player you're listening to. If you wish to reach me directly, feel free to just email me, bill@lightpollutionnews.com. I love to hear from listeners, which brings me to a little side note. My wife, Caitlin, has been hard at work putting together an excellent social media program. However, she will be moving on from that role by the end of this summer. So at this time, we can't really afford to fund the role. The only personnel who receive any sort of funding actually is our audio guy, Caden. So that being said, if you know someone who may be interested in cutting their teeth on social media management, check out the role description on our website. I think this is a role that can really elevate someone who's looking to build a solid portfolio in their career. Like I said, unfortunately, we don't have the funds to make this a paid gig. But if you or someone you know want to have a break in social media marketing, this is an excellent opportunity to prove that you can do what you say you can do before the interview. The role description can be found over on our website under opportunities. So I'm very excited for this August slate of shows. You know, doing these shows, you get to chat with people who are, I think, the most interesting. I think they're fun. I love, this is why I like doing a show. This episode, I want to welcome a new face to the show. He's been involved in education and outreach for over 43 years. He's talked on cruise ships. Did you just get off of a cruise ship, Kelly? Is that? He's living the best retired life you can have. You've been an editor. You've written for Sky and Telescope magazine. And you currently run, I guess, still tied into the excellent podcast, the Sky Tour Astronomy Podcast, for which you've been doing that now for 15, 20, how many years is it?
We're coming up on the 20th anniversary. It started in 2006.
So you're one of the OGs.
I am.
Thank you, Kelly Beatty, for joining me today. I know you do a lot of work also in Massachusetts on dark skies.
Right. I was on the board of directors for the International Dark Sky Association, now Dark Sky International. This source just turned it around for about 10 years. And I have been in Massachusetts for 50 years. And so those juices don't just go away. And I'm on the executive team for our state chapter, and we're doing really amazing things. State legislation, we're doing a lot of local legislation and ordinances and such, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it's keeping me busy in retirement for sure.
Well, I want to ask you on that, because I know the past few years you guys have gotten inched ever closer to having legislation passed up there to promote responsible lighting. Is that going to be a thing in 2025, 2026?
I would like to say yes, but we have, I don't know, there must be an award for the nation's most dysfunctional legislature. And I think that Massachusetts would win that honor. You know, thousands of bills get filed. Very few of them actually get passed. It's very difficult for a little standalone bill like ours to get passed. They tend to get bundled with bigger things if they have any chance. And there is one person in the food chain in the Ways and Means Committee who does not like our bill, and he has blocked it for decades, literally decades. We have 2-year sessions and we file it every session, and we have some ideas. We're trying to build a coalition of stakeholders that includes state offices. So I think that might improve its standing this year.
Well, I would ask you some more about that, Rep, but I don't want to get you in trouble. So well, it's always a struggle, but, you know, put on a good fight. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, I think, on the second show. But I have a question for you, because, Kelly, you've been in this world of education and science and astronomy for so long. You started back in the 70s, and you've seen everything. You've seen the shift.
Yeah.
You've seen the progression. I couldn't help myself, being a history nerd. I came across an article from back in 1990. It was a Christian Science Monitor. And you were one of, I guess, a handful of journalists who were allowed to go into the Soviet Union. And you got to check out their space program, and you got to see. Right. What was that like?
So when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, you could not visit unless you were invited to come. At that time, the guy who was running the Space Research Institute in Moscow, the equivalent of our JPL in the U.S., was named Roald Sergeyev. Very pro-Western guy. He was on the board of directors of the Planetary Society here in the U.S., a close friend of Carl Sagan. And the Russians were going to have a pair of spacecraft going to Halley's Comet by way of Venus. And I happened to be in Europe attending a conference, and I thought, gee, I should try to go to Moscow and cover this. And it was a very convoluted process. But on the day that this spacecraft flew by, I'm in this big auditorium with a couple of hundred Soviet scientists. I had a translator with me. I knew enough Russian to get myself in trouble. And I came to the stark realization that I was the only reporter and the only American in that room. It was kind of stunning and sobering at the same time. And it, you know, I got there because of Sky and Telescope, which has this worldwide reputation for goodness and correctness, you know, and my own reputation. So it was one of the highlights of my career, I have to say.
That had to be incredible. Well, I want to thank you for your years of service to Sky and Telescope. But I know
You're
it's
very
impacted,
kind to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's impacted me. It's impacted many of the people I know, and I know it's impacted many of the listeners. So thank you for all those years. And you guys still is a great magazine, and it upholds a quality, that standard that, you know, is hard to match, I think. Next up is making his return appearance from Bug Life, who I found actually has very little biology background, but that's okay. We won't tell anyone. We'll keep that kind of hidden off to the side. I want to welcome back Mr. David Smith. David, you're the advocacy and the social change manager at Bug Life. We're going to get a little more into details of Bug Life in the next episode, but you have a new campaign, Don't Neglect the Night. I'm going to let you talk about that next episode, but for now, I just want to welcome you back to the show. And I know there's something else out there. You told me that you guys are launching something else at the moment.
We've got some exciting things going on, so it's always a pleasure to come back and talk about all of the things that we've got going. Our new campaign, obviously, as you've mentioned, is up and running, and we've got some bits and pieces that, unfortunately, I can't talk about. They haven't, you know, it's one of those things that's not quite yet got over the line, so I'll have to come back for a third appearance. I'll start clocking up the appearance ratings. But yeah, it's plenty going on over here, and some of our work internationally as well. So hopefully lots to talk about as we go through.
Excellent. Well, you guys are doing great work, and I know Xerxes over here does great work. It's so helpful to have guidance like that from organizations like Bug Life. And I signed up for Don't Neglect the Night, the campaign. I don't know how much you care about having a Yankee on board, but hey, you know what?
It's all about numbers. It's all about public support, right? This helps me do my work by showing I've got public support. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, we can use that, and we can help, work with partners to try and push through some opportunities that are pretty credible right now all across the world. So yeah, any signature to that's really, really useful for us.
I'm very excited about that campaign. Again, we're going to talk about that next episode. So hold on, wait a couple weeks. Next up, I have with me another returning champion, and I'm really glad to have him back with us because I know, Kerem, you always have a bit of realism and straight talk that comes with you. And I really appreciate that. Last time you were on the show was the holiday potluck, where you brought an article and discussed how one community, Stratford, I believe it was able to overcome the clutches of MSG and a new sphere coming into London. Always an inspirational story. I think they tell that one around Christmas every time now. So, Kerem Asfuroglu, do I have that right?
Yes,
Yes.
you do.
All
actually,
right,
it's impressive to me because it's a Turkish surname, and actually you pronounce it better than many Turks. So, thanks for having me, Will. It's great to be here again, and great to see some familiar faces here as well. It's been a while. It just feels like, I think last time it was like 7-8 months ago. And what's been happening is we're still adjusting to our transition from the UK to Ireland. Like, we had twins, and now they're 3 years old. Life is busy, work is busy. But Ireland, as much as the activity is still continuing in the UK, Ireland is an exciting place to be because there's a lot of environmental movement happening here. And I think there are also parts of Ireland they're not encumbered with the convoluted bureaucracies that sometimes you might experience in the UK as well. A smaller population, a bit more nimble in many ways. And so kind of gives you that, wiggle room. The infrastructure is not very rigid. But yeah, mostly I would say, again, comes down to very, very hardworking communities. We've organized workshops with Dark Sky Ireland. Mayor Dark Skies gave artificial lighting workshops to county councils, Roscommon, Galway, Mayo. Mayo is always leading the way. So this is roughly speaking, Connacht region, which is northwest of Ireland. And there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. We just launched the Heritage Community Constellation Project. So initially it was meant to assist 10 communities, quickly ramped up to probably 19 communities that we're going to work with within Mayo to understand their role in Dark Sky's role and how we can support them, mobilize them, specifically tailoring our support to their needs.
Kerem, what's been the feedback on when you go do these presentations, talking with people?
Honestly, mostly very positive. Again, as I always say, most of the time, the reaction we get is I've never thought of this. Or people who are in that realm, they've known of this, but they've never been given a very clear toolkit in terms of sometimes there's a lot of terminology in lighting that really disenfranchises people that sometimes use, I'm also guilty of that. Designers and engineers, they kind of mystify the language. It is really not. And it's very easy to eliminate light pollution. It's the easiest form of pollution to eliminate. And I think it's just the hardest thing was there were actually 4 or 5 speakers, and I was a lighting specialist, but we had lighting engineering department, senior engineer from Mayo County Council. We had Mayor Dark Skies, Giorgio McMillan, and many others who've been really committed to this. So actually, when you come from multiple angles, it makes everybody's life much easier because you're attacking the same thing and actually giving much more ammunition to people to deal with it. So it's not one-dimensional. And I think that's the danger we sometimes find, getting too specialized, too narrow-minded in terms of trying to do the same thing, talking at the same people at the same tone. It doesn't work.
Have you seen an uptick, I guess, in tourism and whatnot in Mayo?
The tourism in Mayo, although there are only 2 destinations in Ireland at this point in time that are dark sky destinations. They have the Wildniffin Dark Sky Park and then the Kerry Dark Sky Park. But I can imagine there'll be a boom in the process of making there'll be at least another couple will just basically be born in the next 3-5 years. One of the hardest challenging aspects of this is we know how these geographies the tourism is such an important force for them, and nocturnal tourism, of course, but it becomes very hard to then quantify, isolate how much of it would be specific to the dark sky tourism. Is always a very difficult thing to do, especially when you're in a country with small population. You need, much more specialized people, researchers, etc., universities to be really quantifying and looking into that, researching maybe over the course of years to really give you some tangible results. And this is the X amount that purely can be attributed to. But that's the difference is they don't care. That's what I like, because all that matters is people do understand the healthy nocturnal environment is healthy environment, period. So they're only seeing this as just part of the bigger picture of conserving environment.
Oh, that's great to hear. I don't hear a lot of that over here about having a healthy nocturnal environment, how it corresponds to the daytime. And we're going to get into a little bit of crime stuff today, but that's a very similar story that they say in the crime studies versus having a healthy daytime environment corresponds over into a healthy night. So there's a little symmetry there.
Definitely. And I think it's again, you started with the heavy stuff, which is always the hardest, biggest theme. I think the whole theme of darkness, or what light is, what is low, what is high, what's perception of illumination, it's very context driven as much as it's cultural. If you're in, rural parts of the UK or Ireland, your perception of what darkness, intimidating level of darkness would be very, very different than somebody living in the center of London or Dublin. But again, crime, there's been, lots of studies. At this point in time, I don't think there's any credible evidence that, really shows that light deters crime. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But also, it's interesting. There's been studies done by the Metropolitan Police in London. It was very comprehensive. And although they couldn't necessarily connect it to, light having any impacts or influence over the crime rate, but they did see wherever there is, let's say, alcohol consumption is involved, like there's definitely more nighttime crime being involved. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody's consuming alcohol is going to be a potential criminal, but you can see it, understand it in the city context to a certain extent. Another interesting thing is whenever they saw increase within the nighttime crime rate, that always correlated with the daytime crime rate as well. So if you were looking only at the nighttime crime, again, that would be very one-dimensional.
No, that's a great point. Well, let's jump into it. Let's jump right into some crime studies since we're talking about it. So I had 2 pieces come through this month. I want to start by saying this study did not look at lighting measurements and overlay of data. Rather, the study, does darkness increase the risk of certain types of crime, solely looks at the assumption that if it is nighttime, it is perceived to be dark, and if it is daytime, it is perceived to be light. This is common vernacular for these types of studies. No matter how flawed or ignorant that framing is, that's just the terminology that they end up using in these kind of studies. I obviously cannot speak for the area, which is South Yorkshire, England. If this is a study done here in the U.S., I certainly have say that nighttime is no guarantee that you'll have any darkness. If it was here in Philadelphia, there's no darkness to be found. So nighttime is the exact same as daytime. You get the gist. So the study assessed statistical chances of one falling victim to a series of crimes at night, spanning from violent crime to theft and burglary. And they found that at nighttime, for you to listen at home, make a note, I'm purposely not using their words of darkness. Nighttime, there's an increased risk of bicycle theft, burglary, criminal damage, personal robbery, and vehicle offenses, lumping the overwhelming majority of crimes into theft-related offenses. They did not find an increase in propensity for violent crimes and rape, given the daytime-nighttime hour split. The authors of the study set out primarily to assess how darkness itself affects crime. And I'm not sure you can really do that in an urban area, unless this area is one of those areas affected by your insane roving streetlight reductions that you guys seem to have in certain towns, turning off the lights, and other towns. Interesting experiment over there in the UK, David. So, Kerem, data on crime, right?
I'm it makes sense to me, the findings, to an extent. I can understand that, crimes of this caliber might actually, might be the opportunity for nighttime to be committed because, you have less footfall that might actually have an opportunity to just not be seen. Or
can I pause you right there? To not be seen part. There's a structured logic that at night, if you put the lights on, you're going to have more surveillance. But I don't think that's true in practice. When I walk down the street, we have really super bright LEDs, and I don't see anyone with their shades up. Right? Like everyone has blackout curtains inside because they have to prevent this light from coming in. No, there's no surveillance happening. Where's this magical surveillance happening?
For example, if you're in central London somewhere, there'll be definitely, that's the land of CCTV. So they'll be doing surveillance for you in some way. But again, this is what I try to get at. It's very context specific in terms of, for example, your reality of what night is at this, particular place where you live on the street is just basically, it's very bright. And others would be completely different in many ways. Even from borough to borough within London would be very different. If you're in Barnet, for example, it's been on the news recently, again, maybe on the upper end of the spectrum. I used to live in Haringey and and then if you go to South London, it's interesting. I often find, I don't know, I don't have any evidence to back that up. I was really hoping to find a partner to carry out a study of this kind. My theory is, the more affluent an area, there'll be less street lighting. And I think it's the more that the There are imposed concerns about security and safety in an area, whether they are real or not. If it's coming from the authority, then the lights tend to be quite bright. That was my experience, because there are parts of North London that I lived in, the street lights were incredibly bright. Still same borough, different treatment. So it's very difficult to get around. But the thing that I can only talk from experience. Crime is a very complex social thing to crack. So it's when we just look at it, trying to gauge it, understanding from the dimension of light, I think it will always be you almost taking a section through the middle of it. You're not having the whole four-dimensional view of it, understanding the full context of it. But for example, when we were working with Precedent and Norton, so by the time I got involved, that's the first dark sky community in Wales. It took us 5 years to come to that level. It took the community 6 years. But it was very interesting because when I went up there for the first time in, I think, 2018, 19, I was expecting to find sodium lights, which is the reality you would find mostly in UK and Ireland. Like if you go into rural areas, obviously now that sodium is discontinued, every one of those towns are getting retrofitted with LEDs with a rapid speed. But they've transitioned to LEDs back in 2008 because they struggled to get funding from Welsh government. So they said, okay, we just need to save money. Basically went and rolled across their LED, refurbishment scheme. And they actually introduced the light pollution problem to themselves by picking LEDs that throw light in every direction. And basically, they were all 6,500 Kelvin. It's basically blue. So they transitioned from 2,200 to 6,500 Kelvin. And so it was pretty great. But as part of that study, they also said, we're going to switch off some roads, 50% of the roads after curfew, after midnight. And there was an uproar. People said the crime will, go, off the charts. You can't do this to us. They were like, we don't have any funding. We have to do it. They've done it. They saved a lot of money through that LED transformation, but equally, they've also seen the crime levels start dropping because in their particular context, what they understood is that crime was committed by a younger demographic, which saw light as an opportunity, and the lack of illumination also, put them off in terms of they weren't really interested in going to these areas. Is this the right way of tackling crime? No, it's very artificial way of tackling crime in some ways. I think, if you really want to talk about the roots of the crime, you got to get even, more dimensional than that, I think.
There have been studies involving lighting and crime for decades. In the early going, those studies were funded by lighting concerns. So, they wanted to have an outcome that showed that lighting helped. This particular study, and Kerem kind of touched on it, it is so complicated to disentangle the various factors. And in this particular study, when they're only comparing daylight versus darkness, it's really not about whether the darkness is lit or not. A lot of it is just the physicality of the circumstances of being at night. For example, I think we'll get into this, the perception of safety versus whether you're actually more safe. I can easily imagine that somebody feels less safe at night, not necessarily because there is light or isn't light, but here's two factors. There are fewer people around in any given settings, fewer people around the street. So there's fewer people to help you if you get in trouble. And there are fewer businesses open at night. And so you can't just run and bang on the door and expect, the business owner to let you in because somebody is trying to rob you or something like that. And those are the kinds of subtle things that I think are never really fully addressed in these kinds of studies. I was looking at that one you were referencing, Bill, in particular, and those 5 kinds of crimes that there was a slight increase at night over daytime rates, maybe, but it didn't really address what the lighting situation was in those locales when those statistics were gathered.
Yeah, didn't talk about those at all. Kelly, great points. I want to go back to some, Kerem, you said about the lighting in certain communities, high risk communities, is much harsher. So part of your hypothesis is policy is already skewed, and there's a moral hazard there by the framing of it from a policy standpoint, because we have policies here in the U.S. that do just that. They target what they consider high-risk areas and just flood them with light. right? Like that's a policy. That's a policy of this city right here, Flint, Michigan. It's a policy of many cities. And from that standpoint, that it might be best to look at to see if, it actually ends up working, in the long term. But yeah, that's
like, as a designer, I can, we always want our jobs to be like very relevant. But like, I think I can definitely understand safety being a very, very relevant argument. Safety is about seeing where you're going and not, twisting your ankle and like, not breaking your neck, just going from A to B safely and soundly. Security, I think Kelly touched upon a very important theme. Perception of security is in terms of really quantifying, gauging its reality. It's a lot of it's psychology based, and I think it's arguable. It is true. If you're not perceiving, your environment to be secure, then you're not secure. That's your reality in some ways. So then we're having to go into a collective psychology level of trying to understand the consciousness of the society on a given area. But I think it was Daniel Mendoza who's done a research that he was looking at Chicago levels of light, and he saw through that research that done with the university, they've identified lots of the increase of light levels depending on wealth levels aligned with it. They didn't specifically say they have more light because of they're not as a wealthy society, or there's more specifically crime rates in that area. But that happened to be one of the verticals that they could really establish and see. But there was there's less lights projected, let's say authority lights, local authority or street lighting was provided for areas where there were more, privileged people were living within the community. And I think that's the kind of one of the key aspects and elements in terms of within a given local authority or borough, you won't find consistency in terms of the distribution of illumination. But that's my thing, again, why the community approach is very important. You don't ask, you don't get. If you don't challenge these things, these decisions will be made for you. And if you don't really put any resistance to them, then there's no reason to change them. And I find it very fascinating, for example, when you're doing an LED rollout, now LEDs can live up to 15 years. You're changing the perception of a baby to a teenager in terms of what good lighting or what street lighting means. And that's one of the biggest challenges I find. And it's very difficult to come back from the cool white lighting to go back to warm and gentle, judicious illumination, because that's completely conflicting to whatever they've known as a child.
And I guess you're seeing this on the flip side right now, too. You're seeing communities switch over from high-pressure sodium to LED. And you have a lot of people saying, hey, this high-pressure sodium, to your point, Kerem, right? This is what they grew up with, right? Like, this is what they know they've had last 15 years. The lighting that they like, this warm. And it's kind of shock when they have this white, super bright light. And then the municipality always gets pushback because no one, and to your point, it's a big shift in their perception of what night should be.
Yeah, there's that famous situation in Davis, California, which is a college town, where they were an early adopter of LEDs. It's a very progressive town, and they put in high color temperature LEDs, which had a lot of blue component, and they didn't figure out the lumens that they needed. And the townspeople were in an uproar. They didn't like living in this sort of war zone of the new LED, and they forced the city to replace all the installed LEDs with warmer color temperature LEDs in Phoenix. And this was in part due to the intercession of dark sky advocates. Phoenix is a huge city, and they were in the midst of a rollout of, I think, 4,000 Kelvin LEDs. And they convinced the city council not only to switch to 3,000 to a warmer color temperature, but to replace the ones that had already been installed. So, Kerem, to your point, if you don't speak up, stuff will happen. And when you do speak up, sometimes the answer is no, but sometimes the answer is yes.
You could have a little foot in the door. It's more likely that it's going to be in between. Well, I want to kind of veer us away from the crime topic here, but before we get going on that, to further cement the point that we're talking about here, we had a study that recently looked at streetlight conversion of the city of Leeds, and the community switched over to 89,000 streetlights from high-pressure sodium to LEDs with a color temperature around 3,000 to 4,000 Kelvin, pretty standard switchover. Started in 2019, ended in early 2024, and had a project cost of $22 million pounds, which is astonishing cost on stateside of $30 million USD. During the time through the conversion, the study found that there's no significant reduction in crime after converting fixtures. And I've heard this before from many places, that perhaps a 20% crime reduction. I don't know if this is like a sheet that comes out with these LED conversions, but I hear this a lot from many communities, how it's going to slash it. Atlanta is a great one for it. 20% crime reduction.
The interesting subtext there was that part of the rationale for doing this LED conversion was that it would fight crime, that the crime rate would go down by putting in the LEDs. And I guess it did. But if you read in the fine print, when they control for like daytime crime versus nighttime crime, there was no demonstrable change in the crime rate. If I'm remembering that study, because you mentioned 2 or 3 there, the town, managers could not demonstrate that installing all of these LEDs really led to a reduction in crime.
So I guess is the question, do we need to put capes on these LED poles, on these streetlight poles? I mean, how are they fighting crime? What are they doing to tackle crime out there?
It's somebody, made a very good sales talk there. So if you're like a manufacturer or representative, your job is to sell more merchandise and products. And I think, back then you got to look at it when they sold cigarettes, that's good for your health. I don't necessarily mean it's to the same extent. Light is a very, very essential commodity of the 21st century in many ways. The city life, whether it's like urban, suburban reality, it's parts of our lives now. But the problem with this now, what it established is, although we see no reduction in the crime rate, 15 to 20 years later, when, let's say, this town needs to do another refurbishment, now it's near impossible for me or any engineer getting in that place to say, let's go back to the warm white and let's go maybe do a bit more judicious, maybe a bit more conservative. They'll be like, are you out of your mind? Because we've established a new precedent here. Right. And that's one of the challenges. What we try to do often is in the lack of legislation and, law and framework, what we try to do is we're basing all our arguments on precedents. Pristine, they had the precedent of switching half of their streets off that allowed us to say, we will keep it off because nobody got murdered, nobody got run over. There's no collisions attributed to that. But the more, not only necessarily these places getting brighter, but they're establishing precedents now. It's making near impossible for us to come up with something else because it's completely outlandish to the now established culture.
Right. I actually have a question for David, because I have a couple of friends in England, and this is sort of before the widespread rollout of LEDs. Most people were still working with high pressure sodium, and a lot of communities and provincial areas actually reduced the number of streetlights as strictly as a cost saving measure. They turned off all bunches of streetlights, and they were worried, they were wringing their hands that the crime rates were going to go up, and they didn't go up. And David, can you put any meat on those bones?
It seems to be something that's happening more and more, particular in recent years, given the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that's sort of followed suit. We saw a lot of local councils reducing street lighting in particular to save energy, right? To save money. That's the crux of it. And we've seen some of them continue that process. So, even in recent years, we're seeing this. Some of them are following that up with kind of a bit more of a study and kind of trying to capture what people think about it. And I think that's going to be helpful information, but we're not quite there yet. But it is certainly something that we see happening, and as Prim says, around like some local, certainly particular smaller communities, rural communities, you can get street lighting off like pretty straightforward when there isn't much lighting, despite the fact that the council may want to put it in. The village I live in, very rural, they resisted putting in street lighting for a new housing development. So it is possible, again, because we're lacking that overall legislation and guidance being suitably followed. So we can kind of get this mismatched approach, which can, in some places, benefit the cause that we're working towards. In other cases, it can do the exact opposite, like we've seen here in this example. So it's one of the reasons why we need to kind of work together and why the idea of legislation and regulations is so key for us we create this more uniform approach. But obviously we've got to make sure we find the right balance there rather than going too far one way or the other.
Well, on the topic of neighborhood lighting, right, it doesn't just come down to streetlights. There's an article from Nature Cities, Christopher Kaiba looked at a citizen science data that he collected regarding, I guess, light pollution sources in communities. It looked at 258 participants from 2021 over 32 communities. 9 of them were outside of Germany, garnered 234,000 lights via citizen science data. And what he's arguing is that in of itself is more impactful. Your residential, your business lights are more impactful than just a street light. In that situation down there, right, David, you still have light even if you don't have street lights.
Yeah, well, I know Chris Kaiba pretty well. He and I have worked together. He does the research. I report his research. and he alerted me to this years ago when he first got started. If you imagine satellite image of the Earth taken at night, you're seeing the photons that are basically going straight up. And what Kaiba has demonstrated, and we all know, is that that's not a real good way to assess how much light pollution and trespass and such are happening on the ground. And the satellite data are not high resolution enough to really identify the sources of the lights that are being seen. So that was the nature of this army of 250 people. They literally did a census of all the lights. I think it was a 66 square kilometer area, much bigger area than they initially thought, but they really got gung-ho on it. If you think about it, the only lighting systems that we really have a good handle on the where, when, and how bright are streetlights. We don't have a good way to systematically assess the number of parking lot lights or business lights or interior window lights that are left on all night. And that's what this study was designed to do. And so you're right, Bill, that Kaiba and this team Nachrichten,
better you said it, Kelly, than I did.
Yeah, exactly. Nachrichten, dredging up my old Deutsch. They actually, they assessed not only where the light was coming from, but how they were left on overnight. And what they found, I think the number was in their, maybe they extrapolate this to all of Germany or maybe just in their study area, that 78 million lights that could be turned off because they don't really have any function are left on all night just because it's easier. There's no timer on them or anything like that. And it's a really important study because this puts ground truth in a way to take these satellite data that we're seeing and try to make some sense of it and understand what's really going on at the street level.
So do streetlights get bad rap?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because the amount of light pollution, the light going up into the sky, I think this study actually assessed that or maybe it was another study that you flagged, Bill. The amount of light pollution contributed by streetlight systems is relatively small, 15 to 20%. And so it's this other stuff that are making that footprint that the satellites see.
Yeah, and I believe it. Nowadays buildings are kind of lit up like video games. You have parking lot lights that are angled out using cheap 5,000, 6,000 Kelvin lighting.
Yeah. And if I'm to elaborate, it makes sense to me. For example, I'm just going to take the brightest part of London as an example, a Regent Street, Piccadilly Circus, for example. And if you look at the satellite image of London, you would spot it very quickly because it's just like the brightest, source of illumination. And it was so bright that we've done an artistic experiment once with it, like a project where we've covered, an umbrella with solar panels. There was so much light pollution that actually it could generate enough power without batteries to power lights. But the interesting thing is if you take every single layer of illumination, you will actually find the street lighting itself is not excessive. And if you would be looking at a satellite image, although, yes, you can detect there's more light in this area, but you can't really necessarily probably identify where it's coming from in the sense of these media facades will be vertical. And in terms of the source itself will be, dark from aerial view, but the projected light will be, basically bleaching the area. The street lighting, I'd say within a city or, let's say a city that is in the scale of like millions, a city or like a town in the scale of like, thousands, that's complete different realities. It's very natural to assume there will be less private lighting coming from a small town. There'll be less vertical illumination, if you see what I mean. But that doesn't necessarily mean, and I think the town centers will always be private lighting would make sense to me, that it will definitely contribute to more pollution. And I have to say, like, in a different life in the past, I was also a lighting designer, and I think most of the lighting designers don't really realize how they're part of the problem. When you have a commercial client, there's a particular task, a brief of making your building sing and dance that has to be, light is used as a cosmetic visual embellishment tool. And that comes at a serious impact where we don't really see, because you're essentially, every lighting designer is an electric painter. And unfortunately, there's not enough questioning about what's happened within that given plot. Everything is based on, you got to stand within that context, but then just the sky's the limit, because there's no cohesion unless it's a master plan that, there's a unison in language. Every single plot, every single premise will do its thing. And, just basically, as you said, there'll be lots of offices also trying to show, lighting is also as a cultural reference that we're busy, we're here, we're affluent, we're powerful. So sometimes the office lights are completely, left on when there's no one around, which is mental, but it's also like a way of saying we can afford to waste this money. We got so much influence. That, hidden words, it's not as clearly conveyed, but unfortunately, there's a wasteful culture within private lighting more than the authority or street lighting, I'd say.
There's a building, I think, that was being proposed. I don't know what the status of it is, over in Oklahoma City, that is supposed to have a giant light at the very top to be seen for, I think, 100 miles. So,
what a great idea.
Yeah. Here in Philly, Comcast lights that up. Looks like a vape, for vaping. It looks like a vertical vape up in the sky.
I mean, we have a case of that in Las Vegas. You might recall that the National Park Service had a team that went around to all the national parks and did assessments of how dark the skies were in the national parks. And the one that went to Death Valley to do this study, as they did their all sky panorama, there was a huge light dome over Las Vegas, but there was this streak of light in the sky, very obviously so in the photos. And it was the spotlight atop the Luxor hotel that was intentionally, beaming this millions of candle power light straight up into the sky. And it was obvious from 50 miles away. Oh, sad. Very sad.
Yeah. That's not painting a good picture. I always thought Death Valley was a great spot to pristine skies. Man, even reaches out there. Well, let's deviate a little bit from some of these place conversations we've been having. I want to switch things up over to up in space. Since Kelly, you're here. I think one thing that if any amateur astronomers that may be listening, or sky watchers, casual sky watchers, when you look up at night, you see a lot more things moving than you ever did. You have a lot of stuff up there. AST Mobile, you have the Project Kuiper trying to get its legs up there. You have a new Chinese constellation that's trying to get moving. And you have, obviously, SpaceX. And I couldn't help but bring some of these stories to light before we get to the main story.
So bring it to light. How very funny.
That's the first time I think I've said that in a long time. So thank you, Kelly, for catching me on that. Try and stay away from that one. It happens. So involving Starlink, right? The service is not cheap, and it's apparently not a great space-based solution for internet.
Well, in rural locations. If I saw that. They're putting a hefty surcharge, but it's not in places where they have a high density of customers, like in an inner city. It's like rural Oregon, Eastern Oregon, where their customers are few and far between.
But isn't that where you want Starlink?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's how it was sold, right? It's bringing internet to the world, to third world countries, and you're absolutely right. Now, as we know, people get charged things in the U.S. that they don't get charged elsewhere in the world. We pay more for our pharmaceuticals than David does in England. I mean, we understand stuff like that. But right. And so Starlink, to your core point, Starlink now has more than 7,000 satellites in orbit, with a potential for just its first phase of expanding that to 14,000. The Chinese have a system that they have begun that promises to have 1,000 satellites. There's the Project Kuiper that you mentioned that is, again, private. When the UN back in the 70s and 80s set forth the space, outer space law, we never imagined that there could be one individual the richest man in the world who could have his own damn space program. And that's what we've got here with Elon Musk and these other countries. And so when Musk first started launching Starlinks, they were much more obvious than they are now. And there was a tremendous outcry from astronomers. Remember, his permission for doing this came from the FCC, not from the EPA. So they were like shocked that there was all this outcry. But to the credit of SpaceX, they have gotten together with astronomers to try to mitigate the problem somewhat. And Bill, one of the other links that you sent us, there's a new paint that is perhaps going to be deployed on these satellites that, it absorbs 99% of all the light that strikes it, which could render these satellites. There have been efforts. It has gotten better. They're not as obvious as they used to be. But if you could paint all of the surfaces truly black so that they're not reflecting light back to the ground. Well,
yes, you're right. And I just want to point out that it's going to be 2% visible light. Yes. So it's cutting it in half. I think it was 5%, 2%.
One of the other things that doesn't get talked about often, John Barentine, who's a good friend, he's been following this very, very closely, talked about how all these satellites are literally adding to the background sky glow at night. There's so many of them, and we've all seen them. You need to put an asterisk on that because, yes, they are a problem and we need to solve the problem. But it's also the case that they're in fairly low orbits. And what that means is you will see them between, sunset and 9 p.m., but you're not going to see them from, say, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. because there's no sunlight up there.
I've seen them, and I remember this back in April when I went up to a dark sky location, just staying out midnight, 1 a.m., the sky was moving. It was really jumping. And it could be just a factor of that time of year. It was April. So it could be just a factor of it being April, that time of year, not say like January, December.
Yeah, they're all phased so that they go over your location in April.
Yeah, it was pretty astounding.
To get back to the core point, these are a problem, and they're not just a problem for us backyard observers. What I was seeing, some of the commentary that it could render these satellites to be no brighter than 7th magnitude, and astronomers gauge the brightness of a star by its magnitude, and 7th magnitude would make it invisible to the unaided eye. But it would show up in any astrophoto. It's going to completely mess up the work of, say, the new Rubin Observatory that's going to, photograph a third of the sky every night from its location in Chile. They have to have algorithms to get rid of these satellite tracks, and it's just a problem for professional astronomy and amateur astronomy as well.
Well, for photography, if you're doing photography, right? With the eye, yeah, to your point, exactly. With the eye, you're not going to be able to notice it. Also, that surcharge that we were speaking about earlier went from $250 to $1,000. Kelly, did you say that's not for people living in the rural parts of the Pacific Northwest?
No, it is specifically for those people. There's no customer density. It's kind of the same by analogy. It's like if you want to have cable, remember cable? If you want to have cable run out to your location, or if you wanted to have a natural gas, these are really bad environmental examples, but they're a little closer to home. It costs more to run them out to locations. One of the things that the Biden administration approved in its mega infrastructure bill was a lot of money to bring internet service, the wiring for that, to rural communities that really didn't have it. They've been living on DSL or whatever. And certainly Starlink will help in a lot of cases, and certainly in countries that just don't have the infrastructure to provide like hardwired services. And in that sense, technically, it's a godsend. But, Musk is not doing this out of the goodness of his heart, nor are these other companies. They're doing this to ultimately make money. And so there might be a special introductory offer, but at the end of the day, it's going to cost the subscribers a lot of money.
This is supposed to be the solution to rural people everywhere. And your solution is $1,000 surcharge and you get throttled.
And we all took the view of the night sky after, millennia and eons, and then to service rural communities. What about all these other, like, I don't know, people, indigenous people, like, been looking at the night sky or on the other side of the planet. And, people who will never be needing, for example, or demand the internet to start with. It's a very interesting concept how, one company can decide and alter the reality of the world for commercial gain. It's very short-sighted in many ways. And it's incredible that it's actually permitted and allowed. It makes you wonder. I don't know this enough, but I often wondered, because they're low orbit, what does that mean? What does that mean there? Because there have been some close call events, and there will be 35,000 of these eventually.
Yeah, no, I mean, the amazing thing about the Starlink system anyway is that they relay the information from satellite to satellite using lasers. And so they need to know very precisely where all these other satellites are. So they know with quite great certainty. But one of the things, Bill, in reading up on this before the podcast, I hadn't realized that the average lifetime of a Starlink satellite, if it isn't knocked out of orbit by a solar flare or something like that, is only about 5 years. And I take that as a good sign, because on the assumption that they are deorbited when their lifetime is over, that gives you the opportunity to do a next gen paint job on them, and to make improvements to make them less visible from the ground. We'll just keep our fingers crossed and see if that really comes to pass.
Yes, I agree. And for you at home who may not be aware, solar flares can reduce your lifespan by 10 days, which is not much in the grand scheme of 5-year thing, but whatever. I want to get some health news before we close up today. And I'll go through this real fast. Kerem, here's one for you. To your point, we were speaking about earlier about the environments that we grow up in. From the press down in New Zealand, researcher Dr. Ellen Sirada surveyed 1,000 New Zealanders and found that their feelings on darkness and artificial light was rather positive. They said 97% of New Zealanders actually live under some form of road at night sky, but half of the respondents said that protecting skies was very important. Another 27% found it to be of moderate importance. So again, the environment you grow up in, I think if you go to an urban environment, go to London, it might not be nearly as high, right?
Yeah, whenever I went to Cumbria or went to Wales, so, I used to live in London for work. And, those communities always were very, not only resourceful, also they were really not intimidated by darkness, but they also had the skill set to navigate light and dark in a much better way than an urban person can, in many ways. And I see that in Ireland, in rural parts of Ireland all the time, because electrification in Ireland didn't happen at the same speed as the UK. So there'd be still, remote areas that people rely on their resources and their ability to navigate darkness. That's what we're ripping people off from day one, disenfranchising, not really realizing. If you go back, let's say the early modern Europe, when the first street lighting was introduced, let's say 17th century in London and Paris, mainly, didn't come from the intent to capitalize on nighttime economy or just make it nighttime much more social and active. It became a byproduct of that, but it started from the aspect of policing the night. That was the main concern, because darkness was becoming a kind of realm that they couldn't really control. People, congregated, came together to, conspire against the authority. Whenever there was a protest, they would smash the lanterns. Lantern smashing became, because that was kind of they were unseating the authority by just doing that and bringing darkness and chaos and installing public rights back in many ways. So
that still happens today. When you have riots, when you have stuff going on, it happens at night. Except for now it's televised and it's under lights. It still happens. Still, that same idea still happens today.
Bill, I was not surprised at all that result came out of New Zealand. And the reason is that, as Kerem knows, there are 9 certified dark sky places in New Zealand. If I were doing that study, the next question I would have asked was, are you aware that there are certified dark sky places in New Zealand? And I think the answer is going to be yes, because it got a lot of publicity in that country, and it heightened everybody's awareness that, hey, the world thinks we're a dark place, so therefore, let's keep it dark. I mean, I'm thrilled by the result, but I think there's a skewing in there that is not really being reported in the paper.
That's true. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a product of its environment. I agree.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a pride and joy related to the not only the indigenous culture, but also like what I find often is like so many of these communities, I can see lots of correlations between, for example, Wales and Ireland in many ways. Because the electrification didn't come at the same rate and speed in the early days, and where people were longing for the light and electricity to arrive because it was the sign of prosperity. But over the course of all these delay, they had plenty of time to see actually light comes with a lot of issues with it. And actually they had enough time to really work it out that actually this is an important resource to protect and clamp on. So maybe we should actually value that. And yeah, as Kelly said, like, New Zealand is the next thing that is closest to, a dark sky nation. And there are lots of them are gearing up for it, but probably they'll be the one will be championing that first.
Oh, we shall see. We hopefully don't get derailed by the new space economy, but we'll see what happens down there in New Zealand. So I want to end it here for this episode today. And I want to thank my guests, fellow podcaster and all things astronomical education, the immortal Mr. Kelly Beatty. Kelly, where can folks learn about what you're doing now when you're on a cruise ship talking or be it on a podcast?
Yeah, I'm actually pretty averse to social media presence. I have no website. I would just refer people to Sky and Telescope's website, skyandtelescope.org. We do a lot of coverage of these satellite constellations and the threat to astronomy. My podcast, just do skyandtelescope.org/Sky Tour, which is this long running, almost 20-year love affair I've had with explaining. It's about 15 minutes long. No equipment or experience is necessary. I take you out under the sky and I say, let's go find stuff. And I get thrilled just doing that.
It's a great podcast. I've listened many times, and that's what you expect it to be. It's truth in advertising. Also with us is from Bug Life, Mr. David Smith. David, where can people learn more about what you do, what Bug Life does, any of the cool new projects that are going on?
I'll direct everyone to our website, buglife.org.uk. You can find out about all of the work we're doing there on light pollution, but all of the other threats and pressures that are facing invertebrates, not just in the UK, but right around the world. So head over to our website to keep up to date.
Excellent. And Kerem from Dark Source. And how much of your time, I guess, is taken up by Dark Source these days?
Well, more than I'd like it to be, but that's the nature of life, I suppose. Yeah, like it's been interesting in the last couple of years because kind of transition, juggling, design was the main thing. And, I'm a designer. I like, doing design, but the mission takes you to other places. So we're doing a lot of lighting policies, and we're working on the anti-light pollution policy of Mayo. This is done for the first time, working with every department within the county council. So there's lots of interesting stuff happening, and then we're more finding ourselves and doing more and more policy work. But I think you got to get into the trenches, because they have longer lasting impact eventually. So anybody who'd like to, reach out, it's dark-source.com. Drop me a line. Be happy to be connected. And thanks for having me, Bill.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure for all three of you guys. Thank you. I want to thank you at home for joining us today. As a reminder, feel free to drop a comment via any of the links in our show notes. You can always reach me directly, bill@lightpollutionnews.com. Light Pollution News is a listener support show, which means we take no outside advertising, solely rely on you, listener, to help cover our expenses. If you like what we do, why not consider helping us by becoming a supporter? Today's show was recorded July 27th, 2025. I'm your host, Bill McGinney, thanking you once more for joining today. Remember to only shine the light where it's needed. You may have noticed that I didn't really cover too many health articles, and I want to just run you at home through these articles that were in the health news realm this month. There was a sizable amount. So let me get started. From University of Michigan, we humans, we really are seasonal animals, right? In a study from May in NPJ Digital Medicine, researchers suggest that shift worker circadian rhythm adaptation is dependent largely on individuals' biological mechanisms for seasonal timing. We also have an editorial from Frontiers in Neuroscience that discusses how circadian rhythm issues can provide stress and anxiety in teenagers, possibly leading to teen suicide. The takeaway appears to be this. For teens that are already at risk of suicide, subtle increases in nighttime light exposure increased stressors in the form of sleep problems and anxiety. From the Journal of Comparative Psychology B, rats were exposed to 3 environments: constant light, constant darkness, and a controlled daytime-nighttime condition. The findings indicate that long-term exposure to constantly lit environments created the most significant challenges for the pineal gland. Pineal gland, which is a small endocrine gland near the center of the brain, serves as the main regulatory module for the body's sleep-wake circadian rhythm. When constantly exposed to light, the rats exhibited higher blood corticosterone levels, which the authors attributed to chronobiological stress. In another study, this time from the Journal of European Geriatric Medicine, researchers found that direct or ambient light, along with direct or ambient noise, negatively affected sleep quality for a sample size of 2,978 senior adults, that's 65 years or older. Researchers utilized the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index to perform the assessment. This apparently is a widely used self-reported questionnaire given to assess sleep quality and disturbances. And lastly, for health-related news, we have a study from inflammation research that found that artificial light at night weakened rats' ability to respond to inflammation. In a typical day-night cycle, rats' bodies broke down fats and sugars used for responding to inflammation by day, essentially rested by night. The bodies continued to break down the fats, but at a slower rate. When these rats were subjected to dim levels of artificial light at night, around 2 lux for 2 weeks, the 30 Wistar rats in the experimental group experienced circadian disruption that resulted in a weaker response and greater difficulty handling said fats. The control group contained 28 rats, bringing the total sample size to 58. And that is all the news that we have for this month.